He was in Sicily when his son came into the world. Not delayed, not stranded, not caught in some unavoidable emergency that no man could have predicted or prevented. He chose to stay. Lucian Moretti, the man who ran New York's most feared criminal syndicate, who had lieutenants operating in 14 states, who had judges and city councilmen storing his number under fake names in their phones, sat beside his mistress in a rented villa overlooking the Mediterranean Sea and let his phone ring. His wife was 9 months pregnant. She had been counting days. He had been counting excuses. And when the call finally came at 2:47 in the morning, the call that told him labor had begun, Lucian Moretti rolled over, silenced the screen, and closed his eyes. That single moment, that one decision made in the dark of a Sicilian bedroom, it would cost him everything he never knew he was about to lose. If you've ever loved someone who didn't realize your worth until it was too late, this story is going to hit you somewhere deep. Stay with me until the very end, because what happens next will leave you speechless. And if you're watching right now, hit that subscribe button and drop a like. I want to know what city or country you're watching from. Leave it in the comments below. You have no idea how far this story has already traveled. Now let's go back to where it all began. Lucian Moretti did not become the most powerful man in New York's underworld by being soft. He became it by being patient, precise, and completely without sentiment when sentiment was a liability. He had a way of walking into a room that made people recalibrate their posture before he said a single word. Not because he was loud, not because he made threats that filled the air like smoke. It was quieter than that, more unsettling. The kind of authority that lives in the eyes and doesn't need a raised voice to communicate that the conversation only ends when he decides it ends. He was 51 years old, silver at the temples, jaw still sharp, the kind of man who had been handsome in youth and had aged into something more formidable than handsome. He wore custom suits not to impress anyone, but because they were part of the armor, the outer shell of a man who had spent 30 years building a version of himself that the world would fear and respect in equal measure. The Moretti name meant something in this city. It had meant something since his father ran numbers out of a bakery in Little Italy in the 1980s, and it meant something entirely different now. Something larger, more sophisticated, more dangerous. Lucian had expanded what his father built into a network that touched construction contracts, shipping ports, private security firms, and a dozen legitimate-looking businesses that served as both cover and cash flow. The FBI had opened and closed 4 investigations into his operation over 15 years. None of them had ever produced an indictment. He had lawyers who got paid enough that they thought of him as a client and not a liability. He was, by any reasonable measure, untouchable. And for most of his adult life, he had genuinely believed that this, all of this, was the thing that mattered most. Serena came into his life 11 years before the night his son was born. She was 26 then. He was 40. The age gap was the least complicated thing about them. She wasn't from his world. That was the first thing that drew him to her, though he wouldn't have admitted it at the time. He told himself he was attracted to her intelligence, her composure, the way she didn't flinch when he told her the truth about who he was on their 3rd date. That was all true. But the deeper truth, that the one he only understood years later, was that Serena represented something he hadn't felt since he was a boy, watching his mother light a candle in the kitchen on Sunday mornings. She represented the possibility that he might still be a person rather than just a position. He proposed after 8 months. She said yes, though she would later confide to her sister that she'd spent 3 days praying for clarity before she answered. She had told him, plainly and without drama, that she could accept the life he lived if he promised her one thing: honesty. Not about every business dealing, not about things she was better off not knowing. She meant the personal kind, the private kind. "Don't lie to me about us," she had said, sitting across from him at a corner table in a quiet restaurant he'd reserved entirely for the 2 of them that evening. "I can handle a lot of things, Lucian. I've already proven that just by sitting here, but I will not survive being made a fool of." He had taken her hand across the table and told her she would never have to worry about that. He had meant it, in the way men mean things when they say them before they've been tested. He had met Elena Caruso, no relation to his lieutenant, just an unfortunate coincidence of surnames, at a charity function in Palermo 3 years into the marriage. She was the kind of woman who made rooms tilt slightly when she entered them. Lucian had told himself for the first 6 months that it was purely professional. She had connections to shipping routes he needed access to. He had told himself for the next 6 months that it was a physical thing, contained, meaningless in the way he'd trained himself to keep certain compartments of his life sealed from others. By the time the second year arrived, it had become something he didn't put a name to, which was its own kind of answer. Serena suspected before she had evidence. Wives almost always do. She watched the way he held his phone screen down when he set it on tables. She noticed the trips to Sicily that had begun appearing on his calendar with increasing regularity. She observed how he bought her expensive things, jewelry, spa weekends, dinner reservations at places that required a 3-month wait for a table, with the practiced guilt of a man who had learned to convert his absence into objects. She filed these observations away in a part of herself she hadn't shown him in years. She didn't confront. She didn't cry. She began, very quietly, to prepare. She was 33 when she found out she was pregnant. The discovery arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, alone in the bathroom of their penthouse apartment, while Lucian was at a breakfast meeting downtown. She sat on the edge of the tub for a long time holding the test. Her feelings were not simple. They never were, with Lucian. There was a layer of joy she hadn't expected to feel so purely, a bright, animal warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with him at all, that belonged only to the small fact growing inside of her. And underneath that joy, steady and cold as stone, was the knowledge that this changed the calculation in ways she was going to have to think about very carefully. She told him that evening. He was genuinely happy. She could see it cut through the performance he sometimes wore like a second skin. He held her face in both hands and told her she had just given him the one thing he hadn't known he was missing. He said it like he meant it. She believed that he meant it. That was the cruelest part of what came later. Not that he was a man without feeling, but that his feelings simply did not win when they competed against his habits. The pregnancy was not easy. She carried heavy. Her back ached from the 5th month forward. She had swelling in her ankles that made sleep difficult, and a blood pressure reading in her 7th month that sent her obstetrician into a careful, measured conversation about monitoring and contingency plans. Lucian was present for the first 2 trimesters in ways that surprised her. He came to appointments. He sat beside her at the specialist's office and asked questions she hadn't even thought to ask. He made a version of himself available to her that she had almost forgotten existed, the version she had married, the version she had said yes to in that restaurant 11 years ago. And then in her 8th month, the trips to Sicily resumed. She didn't say anything. She counted. He flew to Palermo on a Thursday in what would become the final month of her pregnancy, claiming it was a shipping dispute that required his physical presence. She stood at the window of the penthouse and watched the car pull away from the building and thought, with a clarity that surprised her with its calmness, that she already knew what she needed to do. She called her sister, Maya, that same evening. Maya was 29 and fierce in the way that younger sisters of difficult women sometimes become fierce, as if she had absorbed years of watching Serena absorb things in silence and had decided, somewhere along the way, that she would be the one who said the things out loud. He went back, Serena said. No further explanation needed. Maya was quiet for a moment. What do you need? That was the nature of their relationship. No performance, no extended grief ritual on the phone, just, what do you need? I need you to stay close, Serena said. We're close now, and I don't think he's coming back in time. Do you want him to? Another long pause. I want what I always wanted, Serena said finally. I want the man he told me he was going to be, but I stopped waiting for that man a while ago. Over the following days, while Lucian sat in a villa in Sicily telling a woman named Elena that business was keeping him abroad, Serena quietly completed a process she had been building toward for months. The attorney she used was someone she had found independently, not anyone connected to Lucian's network, not anyone whose loyalties could be compromised. He was a quiet man in his 60s who practiced out of a small office in Brooklyn, and who had seen enough in his career to recognize the particular kind of careful that a woman in this situation needed to be. The paperwork was already in order. She had signed her portion. The rest waited. She packed a bag she kept at Maya's apartment. Not everything, just what mattered. Some clothing, some documents, the small wooden jewelry box her mother had given her, Photographs she had printed physically because she didn't trust digital records in a household where someone with Lucian's resources could access anything. She packed slowly over multiple visits so that nothing looked sudden. She was 9 days from her due date when Lucian called from Palermo to tell her he would be home by the weekend. "Okay," she said. "How are you feeling?" "Heavy," she said, which was true. "I'll be back before anything happens," he told her. "These things never come early." She almost laughed. She held it back. "Okay, Lucian. I love you." She paused just long enough that a man paying attention would have noticed it. "Okay," she said again, and ended the call. She sat in the penthouse that night and listened to the rain against the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city below was wet and lit and indifferent, the way New York always was. A place that kept moving regardless of what any particular human being was going through inside any particular building. She put one hand on her stomach and felt the shift of the baby against her palm. He moved. She had already decided his name weeks ago, without consulting Lucian. She hadn't mentioned it. It wasn't that she was hiding it from him exactly. It was that the decision had felt like it belonged to her alone. In the same way the last year had slowly peeled back the parts of her life that she had once allowed to belong to both of them. She was still at the window at midnight when the first contraction came. She knew immediately that it was real. Not the false labor she'd had twice in the 8th month that her obstetrician had prepared her for. This was different in the way that her body seemed to have been waiting for it, leaning into the feeling rather than resisting it, the way something that has been building for a very long time finally arrives and feels, despite everything, inevitable. She called Maya first. "It's time," she said. She heard Maya move immediately on the other end. Keys, footsteps, the sound of a door. "I'm coming right now. Don't call him until I get there." "I have to call him," Serena said. "Serena." "I have to, Maya. Whatever happens after, I have to be the person who called." There was a silence on the line. "Okay," Maya said. "Call him, but don't wait for his answer before you call the car." She called Lucian at 2:47 in the morning. She remembered the time because she had looked at the clock on the microwave in the kitchen when the contraction that told her to call him finally passed. The phone rang 4 times, went to voicemail. She waited 90 seconds and called again. This time it rang twice before going to voicemail, meaning he had seen the screen, seen her name, and declined it. She stood in the kitchen of the penthouse in the dark, hand on her stomach, and absorbed that. Just that fact, clean and exact. He had seen her name. He had pressed the button. She called the car service. Then she called her doctor's service and reported where she was in labor. Then she texted Lucian. "Labor has started. Going to the hospital. Come home." She watched the message show delivered, then read. No response came. Maya arrived 18 minutes later, breathless and still in the clothes she'd clearly been wearing when she went to sleep. A worn university sweatshirt and jeans she'd pulled on in the dark. She took one look at Serena standing in the entry with a bag over one shoulder and her coat already on, and did not say a single word about Lucian. She just put her arm through Serena's free arm and walked with her to the elevator. In the car going downtown through the rain-slicked empty streets, Serena stared at her phone. A text had finally come through from Lucian. "I saw the message. I'm looking at flights. You have time. First labors are long." Maya was reading over her shoulder. She made a sound in the back of her throat that she converted into silence before it became words. "He's not coming tonight," Serena said. Her voice had no particular quality. Not angry, not broken. Something past both of those things. The tone of a woman who has been shown the exact thing she already knew and finds that confirmation is its own particular kind of grief. "No," Maya said quietly. "He's not." The hospital was busy even at that hour. The maternity ward had that specific nighttime energy, hushed but alert, the sounds of monitors and soft shoes on linoleum, the occasional noise from behind a curtain that reminded everyone in the hallway what was happening on the other side of these walls. A nurse showed Serena to her room and asked if there was anyone else coming. "This is everyone," Serena said. She labored through the rest of that night and into the following morning and into the early afternoon. 14 hours in total. Maya stayed for all of it. She held Serena's hand during contractions and got ice chips and argued with the nurse about the thermostat and told the same story 3 times about a neighbor's dog to make Serena laugh between the hard parts, because Maya had learned long ago that laughter and pain could occupy the same moment and that the laughter sometimes made the pain more bearable. Lucian sent 3 more texts during those 14 hours. Serena saw them on her phone between contractions and did not respond to any of them. At 4:52 in the afternoon, her son was born. He was 7 pounds, 4 ounces. He was healthy. He cried with what the attending nurse called excellent volume, which made Maya laugh out loud in a way that broke all the tension in the room at once. Serena held him against her chest and looked at his face and felt the specific, staggering reality of meeting someone you already love before you know anything about them. She cried. Not because of Lucian, or not only because of Lucian. She cried because the thing she was holding was real and whole and entirely hers, and because the word hers had a new and very specific weight in that moment that she understood she would carry differently from this point forward. She named him Marco. She did not consult anyone about this decision. She told the nurse the name when the paperwork came, and she felt the solidity of it as she said it aloud for the first time in that room with her sister and her newborn son and no one else. Her phone buzzed. Lucian again. "I'm at the airport. Tell me you're okay." She put the phone face down on the bedside table and looked at her son. In a villa outside Palermo, Lucian Moretti finally put on his jacket and picked up his bag and walked toward the door, 6 hours after the first call, 12 hours after he could have been on a plane, 14 hours after his wife's labor began. He had convinced himself repeatedly through those hours that there was still time, that first labors ran long, that she was in good hands, that the distance between his choice to stay and the actual consequence of that choice was not as short as it was. He was not a man given to self-examination, but even he felt something uncomfortable settle into him as he checked his phone and saw a text from Maya, not Serena, Maya, that said simply, "He's here. He's healthy. His name is Marco. Serena is resting." He read it twice. He sat down on the edge of the bed he had shared with Elena Caruso for the past 4 days, and he felt something he could not immediately name. Something that wasn't guilt exactly, or not only guilt, but the first tremor of understanding that he had made a calculation and the calculation had been wrong, and that this specific wrong would not be the kind of thing that expensive jewelry and rehearsed apologies could close. He had missed his son being born. He had chosen to miss it. He sat in that room for a long time before he finished putting on his jacket and walked out. Lucian Moretti landed at JFK at 6:40 in the morning, 2 days after his son was born. Not the next flight. 2 days later. He told himself the delay was unavoidable, a complication with the shipping arrangement that couldn't be handed off mid-negotiation, a series of calls that had to happen in person because certain conversations couldn't exist on recorded lines. He told himself these things with the practiced fluency of a man who had spent 30 years converting inconvenient truths into acceptable narratives. He was good at it. He had built an empire partly on that skill. But somewhere over the Atlantic, in the leather seat of a private charter with a glass of whiskey he wasn't drinking, Lucian had sat with the quiet and felt the story he was telling himself begin to develop cracks. The car met him at the terminal. His driver, a thick-necked man named Sal, who had been with the Moretti operation for 19 years, said nothing beyond a nod when Lucian got in. Sal had a daughter. Sal had been in the waiting room when she was born, Lucian knew, because Sal had asked for the night off, and Lucian had given it without question. The memory of that arrived now with an unpleasant sharpness. They drove through the early morning city in silence. Lucian had a gift bag on the seat beside him. He had stopped in the airport at Palermo before departure and purchased things that the shop carried. A small stuffed animal, a cashmere blanket in pale yellow, a bracelet for Serena that the woman behind the counter had told him was very popular with new mothers. He had paid without looking at the price and had felt, in the moment of buying these objects, that he was doing something, that the motion of purchasing represented intention, that intention was the same as presence. Somewhere between the airport and the hospital he understood, with a cold and specific clarity, that he had been wrong about that. He called Serena from the car. She picked up on the third ring. "I'm almost there," he said. A pause. "Okay. How is he? How are you?" "We're fine." The word fine landed in a way that word never used to land between them. It used to be neutral. Now it had the texture of a closed door. Serena, I'll see you when you get here, Lucian. She hung up. He looked at the phone for a moment, then set it on the seat beside the gift bag and watched the city scroll past the window. The hospital room was quiet when he arrived. Maya was in the chair by the window, legs pulled up, a coffee cup in her hands, and she looked at him when he walked in with an expression that didn't shift, didn't soften, didn't perform any of the social graces that people usually perform in hospital rooms. She just looked at him the way you look at something you've been expecting and are not surprised to see. Serena was in the bed. She looked exhausted in the bone-deep way that labor leaves women. Not weak, but stripped down to something essential, like everything unnecessary had been burned away in the past 48 hours. She was holding the baby. Marco, his son. Wrapped in a hospital blanket, face slack with the particular unconsciousness of newborns, fingers curled against his cheek. Lucian stopped in the doorway. He had prepared words on the flight. Full sentences. Explanations and apologies and expressions of feeling that he had assembled carefully the way he assembled arguments, logically, structurally, with attention to which points landed first and which needed to come later. Standing in that doorway looking at his wife and his son, every word he had prepared dissolved. Serena, he said. Just her name. That was all that came out. She looked at him. Her expression was not angry. He had prepared for angry. Angry was something he knew how to navigate. He had been navigating other people's anger his entire adult life. What her face held was something he didn't have a strategy for. It was calm in a way that felt final, like a decision that had already been made and required no further deliberation. Come meet your son, she said. He crossed the room and stood beside the bed and looked down at Marco, and the thing that happened in his chest in that moment was not something he had words for. It was large and sudden, and it bypassed all the armor. He reached out and touched the baby's hand with one finger, and Marco's fingers moved, not grasping, just moving, the reflexive response of new life to the presence of something warm. And Lucian Moretti felt something crack open in the center of him that he didn't know how to close. He started. He's perfect, Maya said from the chair. Her voice was flat, informational, not offering him anything. Lucian didn't look at her. Can I hold him? Serena studied him for a moment, then she shifted Marco carefully and offered him up. Lucian sat on the edge of the bed and took his son in both hands with an awkwardness that surprised him. He was a man who was never awkward, who had trained himself out of uncertainty in most physical situations, but holding a newborn was different from anything his training had covered. He adjusted. He found the weight of the child settling against his forearm. He looked at the face. Marco had Serena's nose. Everything else was still becoming something. I'm sorry, Lucian said, quietly, not performing it for Maya, just saying it because it was the only thing that was true. Serena said nothing. I should have been here. I know that. There is no... Lucian, her voice was not raised. Don't. I need to say, I know what you need to say. She looked at him steadily. I've been imagining this conversation for 2 days. I know exactly what you need to say, and I know exactly how you'll say it. And I'm telling you, not now, not here. He closed his mouth. Hold your son, she said. That's what you can do right now. He held Marco for 11 minutes. He knew the duration because he watched the clock on the wall without meaning to, the way a man who is about to lose something measures the time he has left with it. At the end of those 11 minutes, Serena reached out and took the baby back, and the gesture was gentle, but it was not a question. It was a retrieval. You should go home, she said. Get some sleep. We'll be discharged tomorrow. I want to stay. I know. She looked at him. Go home, Lucian. He looked at Maya. Maya looked back at him with the same expression she'd worn since he walked in. Nothing given, nothing offered. He looked at his wife. He looked at his son. He picked up the gift bag and set it on the bedside table and left. In the elevator going down, he was alone. He stood with his hands in his coat pockets and stared at the steel doors and let himself feel, for exactly the duration of that elevator ride, how badly he had miscalculated. Then the doors opened and he walked through the lobby and out into the cold morning air and put his face back together, and by the time Sal pulled up with the car, the man who got in was recognizably Lucian Moretti again. collected, deliberate, unreadable. But something had shifted. He could feel it, like a plate moving underground. Nothing visible on the surface yet, but the ground was not the same as it had been. He went home to the penthouse and did not sleep. Instead, he sat in the living room in the dark and called Danny Caruso. Danny Caruso was 44 years old and had been with the Moretti organization since his mid-20s. He was Lucian's most trusted lieutenant, which meant, in practical terms, that he was the man who managed the day-to-day operational decisions when Lucian was unavailable. The man who knew where every body was buried in the metaphorical and occasionally literal sense. The man who had access to systems and accounts and relationships that Lucian had deliberately shared because trust, within the bounds of this kind of organization, required demonstration. Danny was compact, precise, and had a stillness about him that made people underestimate how much he was processing at any given moment. Lucian had always read this as loyalty. He had never considered that it might be something else. "Boss sus," Danny picked up on the first ring. "You're back." "Just got in." Lucian paused. "Everything quiet while I was away?" The Bellini situation got resolved. Mancuso is going to be a problem by spring. His guys have been moving into the West Side docks again. Nothing critical, it held. "Good." Another pause. "I need you to handle some things at home for a few days. Serena and the baby are coming home tomorrow. I want the penthouse. I want someone on the door. I want the elevator access changed. I want—" "Already handled," Danny said. "I had Nico set it up this morning." Lucian stopped. "I didn't ask you to do that." "I anticipated," Danny said. "I figured you'd want the security upgraded with the baby coming home. Was I wrong?" A beat of silence. "No," Lucian said. "You weren't wrong." "Good. Get some sleep, Lucian. You sound like you've been awake for 2 days." "Close enough." "She doing okay?" "Serena?" The question was natural, appropriate. Danny had known Serena for years, had attended their wedding, had sent flowers when the pregnancy was announced. There was no reasonable basis for the very slight, very instinctive hesitation Lucian felt at the question. "She's fine," Lucian said. Same word Serena had used, carrying the same weight now in his own mouth. He hung up and sat in the dark and tried to identify what had made him hesitate. He couldn't place it. He filed it away in the part of his mind where things went when they needed more time to become clear. He went to sleep in the chair and woke up 4 hours later with a stiff neck and the particular bleak alertness of insufficient rest, and went to make coffee, and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the city in the gray winter morning and thought about his son's fingers moving against his. Serena came home the following afternoon. She moved through the penthouse with a quietness that was different from her usual quiet. Serena had always been a woman who occupied space thoughtfully. She was not loud, not expansive, but her presence had always had a particular quality, a warmth that Lucian had stopped consciously noticing years ago, the way you stop consciously noticing the temperature of a room you're always in. What he noticed now was its absence. She walked through the apartment that had been their shared home for 8 years, and she moved through it like someone assessing it, like someone calculating distance. Maya stayed for the first 3 days. She slept in the guest room and moved around the penthouse with an efficiency that left no room for Lucian to settle into any comfortable domestic arrangement. When he came into the kitchen, she finished what she was doing and left. Not dramatically, just efficiently, like she had decided that shared space with him was a resource she was going to meter carefully. On the second evening, Lucian came to find Serena in the nursery. The room had been prepared months ago. Pale walls, a crib he had assembled himself on a Sunday in October when he'd been in one of his periods of genuine domestic effort, a mobile above it that played something soft and wordless when you wound it. Serena was in the rocking chair nursing Marco, and she looked up when Lucian appeared in the doorway but didn't ask him to leave. He leaned against the doorframe. "Can we talk tonight? After he's down?" "About what?" "About us. About— I know I owe you more than I gave you at the hospital. I want to— Lucian." She looked down at Marco. "I've been home for 1 day. I just had a baby 4 days ago. I am not having that conversation tonight." "Then when?" "I don't know." She didn't look up. "When I'm ready." "That's not—" He stopped himself. She looked up then. "Finish it," she said. "That's not what?" He recognized the trap and had the discipline not to step into it. "Nothing. Whenever you're ready." He went back to the living room and poured a drink he didn't want and sat with it and felt the apartment around him like a room he no longer recognized the geometry of. 4 days after Serena came home, Maya left. The morning Maya walked out with her overnight bag, she stopped in the entry where Lucian was standing with a coffee and looked at him with the directness that had always been her particular quality. "You know what the worst part is?" she said. He waited. She saw it coming, long before it happened. She made a plan because she knew she couldn't count on you. Maya picked up her bag. She gave you every opportunity to be the person she needed, and you couldn't stop being the person you were comfortable being instead. She looked at him without cruelty, just with the flatness of someone stating observable fact. Whatever she decides, that's hers to decide. You don't get an opinion on the timeline. She left. Lucian stood in the entry for a long moment. Then he went back to the kitchen and stood at the window again and drank his cold coffee and tried to determine whether Maya's assessment was accurate or whether it was the partial view of a protective younger sister. He turned it over. He was honest with himself in the way that he was only honest when no one else was present to require anything from him. He decided it was accurate. The following week was the quietest he had ever spent in 30 years of a life that was almost never quiet. He went to 2 low-level operational meetings and delegated the rest. He came home. He watched Serena move through the apartment with Marco, watched her learn the language of her son, which cry meant hunger, which meant discomfort, the specific pitch of the one that meant nothing was wrong. He simply wanted to be held. He watched her master this new vocabulary with the same careful intelligence she applied to everything, and he understood that she was becoming fluent in something that he had already missed the first lessons of. He tried to participate. He asked to hold Marco in the evenings. Serena allowed it. She sat nearby when he did, never fully leaving the room, and there was something in that proximity that told him clearly it was not maternal hovering. It was assessment. She was watching him with their son the way you watch someone with something precious to determine whether they can be trusted with it. He was on the phone in his office 10 days after Serena came home when he heard her cry for the first time. Not visible crying. She was in the nursery, door nearly closed, and the sound was muffled and brief. She caught it fast, the way women who have decided not to be seen grieving catch themselves. But he heard it. One sharp intake, then silence, then the soft mechanical lull of the mobile plane. He sat with his phone pressed to his ear, and the voice on the other end saying something about the Mancuso situation, and he could not process a single word of it. "I'll call you back," he said, and hung up. He stood outside the nursery door. He raised his hand to knock and then held it there without touching the wood. He stood like that for almost a full minute. Then he lowered his hand and walked back to his office and closed the door and sat in the chair behind his desk. The desk that had hosted 100 negotiations, a dozen confrontations, 15 years of decisions that had shaped the architecture of an entire criminal enterprise, and put his face in his hands. He did not go to her. He told himself she would not want him to. He told himself the kindest thing he could do was give her space. He told himself these things and recognized, even as he told them, that they were the same mechanism he always used, the conversion of his own discomfort into an apparent act of consideration for someone else. He was still sitting like that when his phone rang again. Danny. "We have a problem with the Mancuso thing," Danny said. "He's moving faster than we thought. He's got eyes on the Red Hook operation." "How did he find out about Red Hook?" A pause. "I'm looking into it." "Who knew about Red Hook?" "Small group, myself, Nico, Petrov, and the 2 dock supervisors. Then it came from one of 5 people." "That's what I'm working on," Danny said. "Give me 48 hours. Lucian processed this. The Red Hook operation was not high profile, but it was structurally important, a logistics point that connected 3 separate revenue streams. For Mancuso to have intelligence on it meant either a surveillance operation that had been running longer than they detected, or someone inside had spoken. The second possibility was the one that sat wrong. 48 hours, Lucian said. "Then I want a name." He hung up and felt the shape of 2 problems existing simultaneously, one in his personal life, one in his professional life, and the uncomfortable understanding that he had spent 30 years being exceptional at managing problems in the second category while apparently being catastrophically poor at managing the first. He went to bed that night and lay on his side of a bed that still had two sides and listened to the baby monitor on Serena's nightstand and stared at the ceiling. At 2 in the morning, he heard Serena get up with Marco. He heard her in the nursery through the wall. He heard her voice, low and steady and entirely private, talking to the baby in the particular senseless, perfect way that people talk to newborns. Not expecting response, not performing for an audience, just offering sound as a form of presence. He lay in the dark and listened to the murmur of her voice through the wall and understood he had never felt more distant from her than he did in that moment, separated by 12 inches of drywall and approximately 11 years of accumulated choices. He was still awake at 4. He heard her come back to bed. He heard her breathing slow. He watched the ceiling get lighter as the city outside began its pre-dawn shift from darkness to gray. He reached a decision somewhere in that gray light, not dramatic, not cinematic, just the quiet arrival of something he'd been building toward for days. He was going to fix this. He didn't have specifics yet. He was not a man who operated without specifics. But the direction was clear. He was going to put this marriage back together. He was going to do whatever it took. He had fixed harder problems than a broken marriage. He had rebuilt things from worse starting conditions than this. He was Lucian Moretti. He did not lose what he decided to keep. He had no way of knowing that Serena had reached her own decision 6 hours earlier. She had signed the second set of divorce papers at 11:30 that night, while Marco slept, sitting at the small desk in the corner of the nursery with a pen her attorney had sent in a plain envelope 3 days prior. She had not cried while she signed them. She had cried before, that brief, sharp grief he'd heard through the door, and the crying had clarified something rather than extended it. She had signed clearly, without hesitation, and had placed the papers in the envelope and sealed it, and had sat in the rocker for a while afterward, looking at her son's sleeping face. She had not felt relief exactly. She had felt the particular stillness that comes after a long effort finally completes, the absence of the weight of a decision not yet made. The papers were in her bag. Her attorney would have them by the end of the week. The rest of her plan, the part that went beyond the legal document, the part she had been building quietly for months with Maya's help, and the help of one other person whose involvement Lucian would not discover until later, was nearly ready. She needed 5 more days. She had calculated 5 days from the moment she came home from the hospital. 5 days to let Lucian believe in the possibility of negotiation. 5 days to complete the last details of the arrangement. 5 days to give her son the continuity of a single stable location before everything changed. On the morning of the 5th day, she woke before Lucian and dressed Marco in the small gray outfit that Maya had bought, the one with the white bear on the chest, and put him in the carrier against her body and picked up the bag she had packed the night before while Lucian slept. Not her full bag, a curated version, the documents, the wooden jewelry box, the photographs, Marco's essential items, the rest of it, the closet full of clothes, the jewelry Lucian had given her over 11 years, the art on the walls that she had chosen and that she had genuinely loved. She left. She left her wedding ring on the kitchen counter next to the coffee maker, in a place where he would find it immediately and could not mistake its placement for accident. She left the divorce papers beside it in their sealed envelope. She picked up her son and walked to the elevator and pressed the button and stood watching the numbers count upward from the lobby. And she thought about the first time she had ridden this elevator. Not to this apartment, but to a different one, years ago. The first time Lucian had brought her here to show her the city from height, because he'd wanted to give her something that couldn't be purchased. She had looked out at the skyline and thought that she had never felt so entirely seen by another person. She thought about that woman, herself, 26 years old, standing at that window, and she felt for her a tenderness that was not nostalgia and not grief, but something more precise than either, a recognition. The elevator arrived. She stepped in. The doors closed behind her. Downstairs, Maya was waiting in a car that was registered to neither of them, driven by a man whose name was not in any of Lucian Moretti's files. They had planned this exact moment for 3 months. The driver pulled away from the building smoothly, without urgency, and merged into the morning traffic. Serena looked at her son's face, pressed against her chest in the carrier, eyes closed, entirely at peace with the motion of the car the way newborns sometimes are. "You okay?" Maya asked from the seat beside her. "Yes," Serena said, and she meant it, in a way she hadn't meant anything in a very long time. In the penthouse 22 floors above, Lucian Moretti's alarm went off at 7:15. He reached to silence it and registered the absence beside him. Not unusual, Serena often rose early with the baby, and lay there for a moment in the residual warmth of sleep before something undefined pulled him upright. The apartment was too quiet. He knew the specific acoustics of his own home, the way you know any place you've lived in long enough. The particular silence of very early morning before the city fully woke, the different silence of midday, the different silence again of late night. This was none of those. He got up. He moved through the hallway. He looked into the nursery. The crib was empty. The mobile was still. The changing table was cleared, not the way it looked after a feeding, but cleared in the deliberate way of things that had been removed rather than used and set aside. He moved faster. Through the living room, the dining room, into the kitchen. He saw the coffee maker first, then the counter beside it. The ring caught the morning light, small and precise and completely devastating in the silence of that kitchen. He picked it up. He looked at it lying in his palm. This object he had placed on her hand 11 years ago in a ceremony where he had made promises he had believed at the time and had subsequently, incrementally failed. He set it down. He picked up the envelope. He turned it over in his hands without opening it, though he knew what it contained. He had known, if he was honest with himself, for longer than he would admit. He set the envelope down beside the ring and put both hands flat on the counter and stood there with his head bent. She was gone. His son was gone. And for the first time in 30 years, Lucian Moretti, the man who controlled a criminal empire, who had never lost anything he decided to keep, stood in his own kitchen and understood with absolute physical certainty that this was one problem his power could not solve in any of the ways his power usually solved things. He picked up his phone. He called Danny. "She's gone," he said when Danny picked up. A pause. "What?" "Serena. She took the baby. She's gone." His voice was level in the way that his voice got level when he was at the edge of something. "I need you to find her." Another pause, slightly longer than the situation seemed to require, though Lucian was too consumed in the moment to clock it. "I'll get on it right now," Danny said. "Today, Danny, not tomorrow. Today." "Understood." Lucian hung up and looked at the ring on the counter and the envelope beside it, and the empty coffee maker and the morning light coming through the windows of an apartment that had been a home and had become, in the course of one night, something entirely different. He was going to find her. He was going to fix this. He was still, in that moment, a man who believed these two things were within his power. He had no idea that the man he had just called to find his wife was the same man who had helped her disappear. The first 48 hours after Serena disappeared, Lucian ran the search the way he ran everything. Systematically, without visible panic, with the cold organizational efficiency that had made him effective for 3 decades. He pulled in 4 of his best people. Not Danny. Danny was coordinating, managing the information flow, acting as the hub through which all reports passed. Lucian gave each operative a specific lane: financial traces, vehicle records, phone triangulation from the last known signal, and physical surveillance on every location Serena had ever mentioned with any frequency. Her sister's apartment was the first priority. He had people on Maya's building within 2 hours of making the call. Maya was there. She answered the door when his man knocked, with the kind of expression that told him she had been expecting exactly this, and she said 3 words: "Get a lawyer," and closed the door. They watched the building for 18 hours before Lucian accepted that Serena was not inside and was not coming. He called in a favor with a contact at a telecommunications company and got Serena's last cell signal. It had gone dark at 7:43 in the morning, 4 blocks from the penthouse. She had either turned the phone off or removed the SIM. He was betting the SIM. She was methodical enough to have thought that far ahead. Her bank account showed a withdrawal of $4,000 in cash 3 days before she left. A small amount, deliberately small. Small enough not to trigger any alert, large enough to be useful for a short period. She had been planning the cash withdrawal for weeks, he realized. She had been planning all of it for weeks. He sat with that understanding in his office on the second night and felt something that was not admiration exactly, but was adjacent to it. The recognition one strategist gives another when the strategy is good. She had thought through the problems he would use to find her, and she had addressed them before she left. The phone, the money, the vehicle. There was no vehicle registered to her or to Maya, or to anyone obviously connected to her that had been activated in the window of her departure. Whoever had driven them had been chosen specifically because their name would not appear in any file Lucian had access to. He found himself wondering for the first time whether she had help from inside. He called Danny on the third morning. "Where are we?" "She's clean," Danny said. "No card activity? No phone? No vehicle we can track?" "She planned this." "I know she planned it." Lucian's voice had the flatness of controlled anger. "I need to know who helped her plan it." "That's a sensitive question, boss." "It's the only question. She didn't build an exit this clean without someone who knows how these things work. Someone who knows what I'd look for and how I'd look." A pause. "Get me the answer." "I'm on it." "Danny." Lucian let the name sit for a moment. "How long do you think it would take someone to put together an exit like this? The cash, the vehicle, the communication blackout. How long?" Another pause. Slightly too long. "Months, probably, if they were careful." "Months," Lucian repeated. "Yeah. So this started before the baby was born." "That's what it looks like." "Which means," Lucian said, "that someone in my organization knew she was planning to leave before I knew my own marriage was ending." He let that land. "Find them." He hung up and sat in the office and turned the logic over. Someone inside. Someone with enough operational knowledge to coach Serena on blind spots, on exactly how Lucian would run a search, and exactly what she needed to do to stay ahead of it. The list of people with that specific knowledge was not long. He began building it in his head with the systematic precision of a man who had survived 30 years, partly by being honest with himself about threats, even when the threats were intimate. He put Danny Caruso's name on the list. Not at the top, not yet, but on the list. On the fourth day, his attorney called with news that was not a surprise but still landed hard. The divorce filing had been received and processed. It was official. Whatever window had existed for informal resolution had closed. It was a legal matter now, which meant it was a public matter in the limited but real sense that courts and records existed, and Lucian Moretti's personal life had just acquired a paper trail he had not consented to. He called the attorney back and spoke for 20 minutes about options. The attorney was careful and measured and told him what he already knew, that Serena had done everything correctly, that the filing was clean, that contesting it would cost time and money and generate attention that someone in Lucian's position had specific reasons to avoid. The child custody question was more complex and more urgent, the attorney said. An infant removed from the marital home by one parent without agreement was a situation the court would take seriously, and Lucian's legal paternity was not in question, but establishing a formal custody arrangement required knowing where Serena and Marco were, which currently he did not. "Find her through legal channels," the attorney said, "through the court process. It's slower, but it's cleaner." "I'll keep that in mind," Lucian said and hung up, and did not intend to use legal channels exclusively or even primarily. On the fifth day, the Mancuso situation escalated. 3 of Lucian's men were jumped outside the Red Hook facility at 4 in the morning. Not killed, Mancuso was not ready for that level of confrontation, or was smart enough to know it would be answered in kind, but beaten badly enough that 2 of them required hospital attention. It was a message. Mancuso was telling him that the Red Hook intelligence was operational, that he had people watching, and that Lucian's distraction with his personal situation had created a window that Mancuso intended to use. Lucian drove to the hospital himself to see his men. He sat beside the bed of a man named Carver, 28 years old, 3 years with the organization, a broken orbital socket and 4 cracked ribs, and asked him what he remembered about the people who had done this. "Professional," Carver said, talking carefully around the damage to his face. "Not Mancuso's usual street guys, trained. They knew where we'd be and when we'd rotate." "They knew the rotation," Lucian said. "Yeah. Came right at the gap, like they'd been watching the pattern for weeks." Lucian sat with that on the drive back. knew the rotation, knew the Red Hook location, knew the surveillance gap. The list of people who knew all three of those things was even smaller than the list of people who could have helped Serena build an exit. He began to understand, in the cold and structured way he processed operational problems, that these two things, Serena's disappearance and the breach at Red Hook, might not be separate problems. They might be the same problem wearing two different faces. He called a meeting for the following morning, not at the usual location. He shifted it to a restaurant he controlled in Midtown, a private room in the back that swept clean for devices every 48 hours. He told Danny, Nico, and Petrov to be there at 9. He did not tell them why. He arrived 20 minutes early and sat with a coffee and thought about angles. Danny arrived first, which was not unusual. Danny was habitually punctual, a professional quality Lucian had always respected. He came in and sat across from Lucian and read the room the way experienced men read rooms, quickly, without appearing to. "You look like you haven't slept," Danny said. "I haven't slept much," Lucian said. "Tell me about Red Hook." "We've tightened the rotation, pulled 2 additional guys from the—" "Before that," Lucian said. "Tell me how Mancuso knew the rotation." Danny's expression didn't shift. That was the thing about Danny. His face was a controlled instrument. "That's what I'm still working on." "Work faster." Nico and Petrov arrived together. Nico was 26 and hungry in the way young men in this organization got hungry, still proving himself, still with edges that hadn't been worn down into competence yet. Petrov was 50, Russian-born, quiet in a way that was different from Danny's quiet. Where Danny's stillness felt like processing, Petrov's felt like patience. Lucian trusted Petrov in the specific way he trusted people who had never given him a concrete reason not to. He laid it out for all three of them without preamble. The Red Hook breach. The Mancuso escalation. The pattern of operational intelligence that had been leaking in ways that suggested not surveillance, but disclosure. "Someone is talking," he said. "I want to know who, and I want to know today." Nico shifted in his chair. "You think it's one of us?" "I think it's someone who knows enough to be useful to Mancuso," Lucian said. "That narrows the field considerably." He watched all three of them. Nico's discomfort was readable. The young man's face was still too expressive for this kind of work, still showing the anxiety of being suspected rather than the steadiness of having nothing to fear. Petrov was still. Danny was looking at the table. Not down exactly, but at a middle distance. The look of a man doing fast calculations behind an expression he was working to keep neutral. Lucian filed that. "I want every financial movement from this group cross-checked against anything anomalous in the past 18 months, Lucian said. "Every outside contact that wasn't pre-cleared. Every conversation that happened outside sanctioned channels." He looked at each of them in turn. "If someone in this room is clean, this process proves it. If someone isn't, I'll know before the week is out." Petrov nodded once. Nico said, "Understood," too quickly. Danny said nothing, and after a moment picked up his coffee and drank from it and set it down, and his hand was completely steady, and Lucian watched the steadiness of that hand and felt something resolve in his chest that had been building for days. He knew. He didn't have proof yet, but he knew. The proof came 6 days later, and it came from a direction he hadn't expected. His financial analyst, a meticulous woman named Carol, who worked out of a secured office in New Jersey and who had been building and maintaining the Moretti organization's shadow, accounting for 11 years, called him on a Thursday afternoon with a specific quality in her voice that she reserved for findings that required him to be sitting down. "Talk to me," he said. "I found a pattern," Carol said. "It goes back 14 months. Small amounts moving through 3 shell structures, 2 of which are ours, one of which is registered to a holding company I didn't recognize. I pulled the holding company." A pause. "It traces back through 2 more layers to an account that has been receiving periodic deposits from a source connected to the Mancuso organization." Lucian was very still. "How much are we talking about?" "In aggregate, over 14 months, approximately 2.3 million. $2.3 million, he said. "Yes. Moving from Mancuso's side to ours." "To one specific account on our side," Carol said. The account is held under a name I don't recognize, but it's clearly a constructed identity. But the access credentials that created it were logged, and the log traces to an internal terminal. Which terminal? She told him. He sat with the phone against his ear, and the information expanding in him like something cold filling a cavity, and he understood completely, and all at once, the architecture of what had been happening. Not just for 14 months, not just since the Mancuso situation began, but possibly for much longer, in ways that were only now becoming visible because he was finally looking at the right angle. Danny Caruso had been on Mancuso's payroll for over a year, possibly longer. The $2.3 million was payment for operational intelligence, the Red Hook location, the rotation schedules, the personnel movements. But that was only the layer Carol could see. The layer underneath it, the one that Lucian had to reconstruct from logic rather than financial records, was more personal and more devastating. Danny had known about Serena's plan. He hadn't just known. He had helped build it. The exit strategy that had been too clean, too operationally precise for a civilian woman to have constructed alone, Danny had built it. He had coached her, provided the vehicle contact, mapped the gaps in Lucian's surveillance capability, and ensured that every piece of the exit was designed to hold against exactly the kind of search Lucian would run. He had used Lucian's failing marriage as an operational tool. He had cultivated Serena's trust, probably for months, maybe longer, not out of sympathy for her, though whatever sympathy he'd expressed would have been genuine enough to be convincing. He had done it because a missing wife and child created specific, predictable disruptions in Lucian's attention, decision-making, and organizational presence. Every hour Lucian spent trying to find his family was an hour the Mancuso operation moved through the gaps Danny had been deliberately widening. He had weaponized Marco's birth. He had taken the worst night of Lucian's life and made it into a strategic instrument. Lucian put the phone down very carefully on the desk in front of him and sat with his hands flat on the surface and breathed. He was not a man who lost control of his body's responses easily. He had trained that out of himself young, had learned in his father's organization that visible emotion was a liability, that the man who could hold stillness when other men couldn't hold it was always the man who survived. He held stillness now. He breathed slowly. He let the information settle into him and find its position and stop being new. Then he picked up the phone and called Carol back and told her to secure everything, every record, every log, every trace, and send nothing to anyone pending further instruction. Then he called Petrov. "I need you to find someone for me," he said, quietly. "Don't use regular channels." "Who?" Petrov said. "Danny." A silence. Then, "How do you want this handled?" "I want him brought in, alive, undamaged. I want to talk to him." "Understood." He hung up and stood up and went to the window of his office. The same window he had stood at 100 times in 30 years, looking out at the city that had made him and that he had, in various ways, shaped in return. And he thought about Danny Caruso sitting across from him in a restaurant 3 weeks ago, with a steady hand on a coffee cup. And he thought about all the rooms they had shared over 20 years, all the problems they had solved together, all the trust that he had extended and that Danny had accepted and quietly converted into currency for someone else. He thought about Marco's face, about Serena in that hospital bed with an expression that was calm in a way that felt final, about the ring on the kitchen counter catching the morning light. He thought about the fact that Danny had known about all of it, had watched it happen, had possibly, in some ways, accelerated it, kept Lucian occupied in Sicily by ensuring the business complications there were slightly more intractable than they needed to be, kept the pressure on in ways that made Lucian's absence feel justified. He had been managed by the man he trusted most for over a year. Petrov called back at 11 that night. He's not at his apartment, not at any of the usual places. His phone is off. Lucian felt the familiar cold of a calculation going wrong. He ran. Looks like it. How fast? His neighbor says she heard him leave around 3 this afternoon, so 8 hours, give or take. 8 hours after a morning meeting where Lucian had announced a financial cross-check. Danny had known immediately what that check would find. He'd had, by Lucian's estimate, about 6 hours from the meeting to the moment he understood that Carol would trace the accounts, and he had used those 6 hours to disappear. He had a go-bag ready, Lucian said. It wasn't a question. Has to have, Petrov said. Who does he run to? Not Mancuso. That's too obvious. Mancuso burns him the second he becomes a liability. Who does he actually run to? I don't know, Petrov said, but I'll find out. Lucian went back to the window. Danny was gone. Serena was gone. Marco was somewhere in this city, or possibly not in this city, in a location he did not know, with a woman who had filed for divorce and had every legal and moral justification for having done so. His operation had a leak that had been running for 14 months, and the man who had managed that leak was currently in the wind, and Mancuso was watching Red Hook and expanding his presence on the west side with the confidence of a man who believed his intelligence gave him an advantage. Everything was moving at once, every wall at the same time. He turned from the window and looked at the room, the office, the desk, the 40 years of accumulated structure that had produced this specific position and this specific problem. And he made a series of decisions in rapid sequence that he would not have made a month ago, because a month ago he had believed that his power was the most durable thing about him. He called Carol again. I need a different kind of analysis. Everything Danny touched, every operation, every account, every contact he managed. I need to know the full scope of what he moved and where it went. That's going to take time, Carol said. How much? A week, maybe 10 days if it goes deep? Make it 5 days. Oh, Lucian, 5 days, Carol. I'll send you 2 more people tomorrow morning. He hung up. He called Petrov back. I want a full watch on every location connected to Mancuso, not Red Hook specifically, everywhere. If Danny makes contact, I want to know within the hour. That's a lot of coverage. Then we need a lot of people. We're stretched already. Then unstretch us. A pause. Pull from the secondary operations if you have to. The Mancuso problem is the primary problem. Everything else waits. He was moving now. Not panicking. Moving. There was a difference, and he had spent 30 years learning it. Panic scattered energy. Movement directed it. He directed it now toward the parts of the problem he could address, and he let the parts he couldn't address yet sit in their incompleteness without demanding resolution before they were ready. But there was one part of the problem he kept returning to. Danny had helped Serena disappear, which meant Danny knew where she was. Which meant if Mancuso had Danny, Mancuso might have that information too. And Mancuso, whose organization had just demonstrated it was willing to put 3 men in the hospital to send a message, might at some point decide that Lucian Moretti's infant son and estranged wife were a more efficient lever than a shipping facility in Red Hook. The thought arrived in Lucian's chest like a fist. He sat down. He put his elbows on the desk and his face in his hands for the second time in 2 weeks, and he stayed very still and thought with absolute precision about the implications of what he had just understood. Serena had run from him to protect herself and Marco. She had used Danny's help to do it. She had built a wall between herself and Lucian that was legally, logistically, and emotionally sound. A wall designed specifically to keep him out. That wall also kept him from protecting them. And now the man who knew where they were had run to the side of an organization that had no reason to wish them well. He picked up the phone. Not to call Petrov, not to call Carol. He called the one number he had not called since the morning he found the ring on the counter. Maya's number. It rang 5 times. He expected voicemail. Then it picked up. Silence on the line. Not dead silence, breathing. She was there. Maya, he said, I know you don't want to hear from me. I understand why. But I need you to listen to what I'm about to tell you, and then I need you to tell Serena. And then I need Serena to make a decision. He paused. Danny Caruso helped her disappear. I know that. I'm not calling to undo that. I can't undo it, and I'm not trying to. I'm calling because Danny is now in the wind and possibly in contact with people who are actively moving against my organization. People who, if they know where Serena and Marco are, might decide that information is useful in ways that have nothing to do with a divorce. The silence on the line changed texture. Still no words, but the quality of the attention shifted. I'm not threatening, Lucian said. I'm not maneuvering. I have no leverage here, and I know it. I'm telling you that my son might be in danger because of something I failed to see in my own organization, and the only thing I care about right now is that he isn't. His voice remained level with effort. Tell her to check in. That's all I'm asking. One call, one message, one confirmation that she and Marco are somewhere safe. That's it. I don't need to know where, I just need to know they're not exposed. He stopped. He waited. Maya's voice came back low and careful. I'll pass it on. The line went dead. Lucian set the phone on the desk and looked at it. He had just done something he had never done in 30 years of operating in a world where showing the full extent of what you needed from someone was always a vulnerability. He had told the truth about what he was afraid of, not to gain something from it, not as a tactic, just because it was true. He sat in his office until 2 a.m, monitoring the reports coming in from Petrov's surveillance teams. Nothing on Danny. Nothing useful on Mancuso's movements beyond the standard posturing at Red Hook. Nothing that told him what he most needed to know. At 2:15, his phone buzzed with a text from a number he didn't recognize. 3 words. We're okay. Marco. He read it 4 times. Then he put the phone face down on the desk and sat in the quiet of his office and felt the specific, terrible relief of a man who has been shown the exact width of the gap between what he almost lost and what still, barely, remained. He understood something in that moment that he had been approaching for weeks without quite arriving at. The empire, the money, the power, the network, the 30 years of ruthless construction, none of it had been able to find his son. None of it had been able to protect Serena. None of it had prevented Danny Caruso from sitting across from him for 20 years with a second set of loyalties that Lucian had never detected because he had been too certain of himself to look. The thing he had built to make himself untouchable had not protected the things that mattered. It had, in specific and measurable ways, destroyed them. He reached a decision that surprised him with its clarity, sitting alone in an office at 2 a.m. with 3 words on a phone and an empire coming apart at the seams around him. He was going to burn it down himself before anyone else could finish the job. And then he was going to figure out what was left of him once the fire went out, whether there was anything in the wreckage worth offering to a woman and a boy who had every reason in the world to want nothing from him at all. 3 words on a phone screen at 2 a.m, and Lucian Moretti made the decision that would dismantle 30 years of his life. He didn't sleep. He sat in the office until gray light began collecting at the edges of the windows, and he built the plan the way he had always built plans, backwards from the outcome, identifying each structural piece, determining the sequence that would make the whole thing hold. Except this time the outcome was the opposite of everything he had ever built toward. This time, the plan was destruction. Controlled, deliberate, irreversible destruction of the thing he had spent his entire adult life constructing. He called Carol at 6 a.m. She answered on the second ring, which told him she hadn't slept either. I need everything, he said. Not just the Danny files. Everything, every account, every operation, every name, every transaction going back 15 years. I need it organized and I need it documented in a format that a federal prosecutor can read without assistance. A long silence. Lucian, I know what I'm asking. Do you? It wasn't a question. Her voice had the specific flatness of someone absorbing information that changes the nature of their employment. You'll be protected, he said. Fully. I'll make sure your cooperation is on record before anything else moves. You won't be touched. Another silence. Then, how long do I have? 2 weeks, maybe less. The Mancuso situation is going to force a timeline I can't fully control. 2 weeks for 15 years of records. You know where everything is, Carol. You built the system. I built it to be hidden, she said, not to be found. Then you know exactly where to look. He paused. I need this. It's the only move I have left that doesn't end with Marco growing up visiting someone in a federal prison, or not visiting anyone at all. The silence this time was different. She was deciding. He could hear it. Okay, she said finally. He hung up and called his personal attorney next, not the one who handled organizational matters, a different one, a man named Ellison, who operated entirely outside the Moretti network, and whose practice was built on a specific subspecialty, negotiated cooperation agreements with federal authorities. Lucian had retained Ellison 7 years ago as a contingency, the way careful men retain contingencies they hope never to use. He had never called Ellison's private line before this morning. Ellison answered and heard the first two sentences and said, "I need you to come in today." "This afternoon," Lucian said. "I'll clear the schedule." He showered, he put on a suit, not out of habit exactly, but because the suit was armor, and he was going into a day that was going to require everything he had. He stood at the bathroom mirror and looked at himself for a moment, which was not something he normally did. The man in the mirror was 51 years old and had not slept in 36 hours, and looked exactly like both of those things were true. The silver at his temples had extended further than he'd noticed. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there a year ago, or that he hadn't allowed himself to see. He thought about Marco, about the specific weight of 7 pounds 4 ounces against his forearm in a hospital room where he had been a stranger to his own child. He picked up his jacket and left. Petrov called at 8:15 while Lucian was in the car. "We found something." "Danny?" "Not directly. But one of Mancuso's mid-level guys, a guy named Farrell, runs logistics for their East Side operation. He reached out to one of our contacts last night, looking to trade information. He says he has something we want." "What does he want for it?" "Safe passage. He says the Mancuso organization is about to move against us in a way that goes beyond Red Hook, and Farrell wants out before it happens." Lucian processed this. A defector from the opposing side, arriving at exactly the moment his own operation was fracturing. The timing was either genuine desperation or a setup designed to pull his attention in a direction that benefited Mancuso. "Where and when?" Lucian asked. "He wants tonight, somewhere neutral. He suggested the parking structure on 43rd. Too exposed. Counter with the warehouse on Imlay. Petrov, I want 4 people there before Farrell arrives. Sweep the building, check the roof, check every vehicle in a 2-block radius. If this is a setup, I want to know before we walk in. And if it's not a setup, then we listen to what he has to say and we make a decision from there." He looked out the window at the morning city moving past. "Either way, I want to know by tonight what Mancuso is planning." The meeting with Ellison ran 3 hours. Lucian laid out the architecture of his cooperation offer with the same precision he'd used to build the organization in the first place. Not everything at once, not a confession, but a structured framework. Here is what I can provide, here is what I need in return, here is the timeline I'm working against. Ellison listened with a legal pad in front of him, and a pen he kept clicking without appearing to notice he was doing it. "The Danny Caruso connection to Mancuso," Ellison said. "That's the most valuable piece." "I know. And you can document it financially. Carol can document it. She'll cooperate fully." Ellison wrote something. "The federal interest in Mancuso has been building for 2 years. If you can give them a documented connection between a Mancuso payment structure and an inside source in your organization, plus the operational intelligence that source provided, you're giving them the conspiracy case they haven't been able to build independently." "Which is why they'll deal," Lucian said. "Which is why they might deal," Ellison corrected. "I need to make contact before we discuss certainties. And Lucian, you understand that even a favorable cooperation agreement means significant dismantlement. Accounts, properties, operations." "I understand." "You're looking at starting over from close to zero." "I understand that too." Ellison studied him with the expression of a man who had sat across from a lot of people in serious situations and had learned to read the difference between someone who thought they understood and someone who actually did. Whatever he saw in Lucian's face seemed to satisfy him. "I'll make contact today," he said, quietly. "Don't discuss this with anyone, not even people you trust." "The people I trusted are the reason I'm in this office," Lucian said. He left Ellison's building at 1 in the afternoon and sat in the car and checked his phone. Nothing from the number that had sent 3 words the night before. He hadn't expected anything. He wasn't going to push. He was looking at the phone when it rang with a number he didn't recognize. Not the same number as Serena's text, a different one entirely. He answered it. Lucian Moretti. The voice on the other end was male, calm, with the specific cadence of a man who is comfortable making calls like this one. "My name is not something I'm going to give you right now. What I'm going to give you is a piece of information, and what you do with it is your business." "Talk," Lucian said. Danny Caruso has been in contact with Vincent Mancuso directly, not through intermediaries, directly. They met this morning at a location in Queens. We have photographs if you need confirmation. Who is we? People who have an interest in the Mancuso organization, not expanding its footprint in this city. Let's leave it there. Lucian filed this. Federal surveillance, possibly. Or a competing interest he hadn't identified yet. Either way, the information was valuable if it was true. What did they discuss? We don't have audio, but the meeting ran 40 minutes, and 2 hours after it ended, Mancuso pulled 3 of his senior people into a private meeting at his place in Howard Beach. Whatever Danny gave him, it accelerated something. Accelerated what? That's the part we don't know. But Farrell reaching out to your people this afternoon, that's connected. Farrell is Mancuso's logistics coordinator. If he's running, it means whatever is being planned is happening fast enough that someone on the inside got scared. The call ended without further pleasantries. Lucian stared at the phone. Whoever had just called him, they had eyes on Mancuso, and on Danny, and on Lucian's own people's movements, and they had chosen this specific moment to make contact, which told him the accelerated timeline was real and that multiple parties were now repositioning at the same time. He called Petrov. The Imlay meeting stays. Move it up to 8. I want it done before Mancuso makes whatever move he's preparing. He spent the afternoon at a secondary location, a nondescript office space he maintained under a corporate name that had no visible connection to the Moretti organization, a place he used specifically when he needed to think without the weight of the penthouse or the main office around him. He spread Carol's preliminary files across a table and went through them page by page, building the complete picture of what Danny had done and when he had done it. It was worse than he'd estimated. The financial diversion started not 14 months ago, but 22. Danny had been positioning for almost 2 years. The early payments were small, testing mechanisms, establishing channels. But the intelligence he'd been feeding Mancuso had operational value that far exceeded the cash. 3 separate Moretti operations had been disrupted in the past year in ways that Lucian had attributed to bad luck, surveillance, or the natural friction of running a complex organization. He understood now that each disruption had been engineered. Danny had been a one-man demolition project operating from the inside, and he had been patient and precise and nearly invisible. What he hadn't been was sentimental. The file made clear that Serena's exit had been useful to him in ways that went beyond creating distraction for Lucian. Danny had used the divorce attorney's office, without the attorney's knowledge, as a dead-drop location for 2 information transfers in the weeks before Serena fled. He had positioned himself as her ally while simultaneously using the logistics of her escape to move documents he needed moved. He had taken the pain of a woman leaving a bad marriage and turned it into an operational courier service. Lucian sat with that specific fact for a long time. He arrived at the Imlay warehouse at 7:30. Petrov met him at the entrance. "Building is clear," Petrov said. "No surveillance equipment found, no vehicles we can't account for within 2 blocks. I've got 2 men on the roof and 2 in the stairwell." "Farrell?" 10 minutes out. He's alone. We've had eyes on him since 4 this afternoon." Inside the warehouse it was cold. January had come in hard, and the building had no active heat. It was storage space for a legitimate trucking company that Lucian nominally controlled, rows of industrial shelving holding sealed pallets, the only light coming from portable work lamps Petrov's men had set up. Lucian stood in the open space between the shelving rows and waited and listened to the building settle around him. Farrell came in at 8:02. He was younger than Lucian had expected, mid-30s, a compact man in a dark coat, his face carrying the specific expression of someone who had made a decision they knew was irreversible and were running on the adrenaline of that irreversibility. He looked at Lucian across the warehouse floor and stopped. "I expected intermediaries," Farrell said. "I'm not interested in intermediaries tonight," Lucian said. "Talk to me." Farrell looked at Petrov, then back at Lucian. "I want the agreement confirmed first. Safe passage. My family out of the city. No retaliation. If what you give me is worth that, you have it. It's worth it." Farrell's jaw was tight. What Mancuso is planning, he's not just moving on Red Hook. That's a distraction. The real target is you personally, not your operation. You. Lucian didn't move. Explain that. Caruso gave him a roadmap, not just operational intelligence, personal intelligence. Your wife, where she is, who helped her, the arrangement she's under. Farrell's eyes were steady in the way the eyes of frightened men sometimes got steady, past the fear and into the pure adrenaline beyond it. Mancuso's plan is to use the child as leverage, not immediately, as a contingency. If the direct operation against you goes wrong, he has a secondary pressure point that he believes you'd trade everything for, including cooperation with his organization. The temperature in the warehouse seemed to drop several degrees. Lucian's breathing didn't change. His face didn't change. But something behind his eyes went very still, the way water goes still before it freezes. He knows where they are, Lucian said. Caruso gave it to him this morning. That's what the meeting in Queens was. And when does this contingency activate? If his operation against you fails, which he expects it might, he knows you've been running a damage assessment on the Caruso leak. He's moving the primary operation up to preempt your response. He wants to hit your remaining infrastructure hard enough in the next 72 hours that you're destabilized before you can consolidate. If he succeeds, the leverage on your wife and son becomes unnecessary. If he doesn't, Farrell stopped. He'll move on them within 24 hours of a failed primary operation. Lucian looked at him for a long moment. How many people does he have in position for the primary operation? 11 for the direct action, another 20 in support and containment. And who is running it? A man named Gresser, brought in from outside. Not one of Mancuso's regular guys, professional. Outside from where? I don't know his background specifically. He came in 2 weeks ago. He's been coordinating with Caruso. Lucian turned to Petrov. I need a name. Gresser. Everything we can find in the next 2 hours. Petrov was already on his phone, moving toward the far end of the warehouse. Lucian looked back at Farrell. The man was breathing shallowly. The adrenaline that had carried him through the information delivery was beginning to metabolize into something less clean, the shaky aftermath of having crossed a line you couldn't walk back across. Where is Caruso now? Lucian asked. Mancuso has him in Howard Beach. He's been moved twice since this morning. I think Mancuso is being careful. He knows Caruso is a liability once the operation completes. He'll use him, and then... Farrell made a small, economical gesture that communicated the rest of the sentence without words. Mancuso will clean up behind himself, Lucian said. That's how he works. Lucian studied Farrell for a moment. You've been with Mancuso for how long? 6 years. 6 years. And you're here. Farrell held his gaze. I have a daughter. She's 4 months old. A beat. I heard about your son. When Mancuso said the contingency involved the kid, I have 4 men above me who heard the same thing, and none of them are standing where I'm standing right now. He paused. I don't know what that makes me. It makes you someone who still has a line, Lucian said. He turned away and walked to where Petrov was standing at the far end of the warehouse. His shoes were loud on the concrete. His mind was running 3 separate tracks simultaneously. The immediate threat to Marco and Serena, the primary Mancuso operation coming in the next 72 hours, and the cooperation agreement with Ellison that was now racing against a timeline that had just compressed dramatically. Gresser, Petrov said when Lucian reached him. I've got a partial. He's freelance, European background, used by 2 different organizations in the last 5 years for exactly this type of consolidated action. He's professional and he's good. How good? Petrov's expression communicated the answer without him having to attach a number to it. Where's he operating from? Lucian asked. Still working on it. But if Mancuso brought him in 2 weeks ago and the operation is 72 hours out, he's already in position, Lucian finished. He's been watching us for 2 weeks. Yes. Which means he knows our current security arrangements and our current personnel movements and our current vulnerabilities. Lucian paused. Which means we can't use any of those. Petrov nodded slowly. So what do we use? Me, Lucian said. Mancuso wants to destabilize me. He wants me reactive, defending on multiple fronts, unable to consolidate. So instead of defending, I give him a target, concentrated, visible, apparently vulnerable. something worth hitting. You're talking about bait. I'm talking about the only play that collapses his timeline on my terms instead of his. Petrov looked at him with the long, measured look of a man who had worked alongside this one for years and who had learned to distinguish between recklessness and a specific kind of calculated risk that occasionally looked identical from the outside. What do you need? First, I need you to move 4 people. People Gresser doesn't have photographs of, people who haven't been in any location connected to our operation in the past 3 weeks, to wherever Serena and Marco are. I don't need to know the location. I need them protected without anyone knowing they're being protected. How do I find the location without you knowing it? Lucian thought for a moment. Call Maya. Use my name. Tell her what's happening. She'll either hang up or she'll cooperate. Given what I told her last night, she'll cooperate. And the second thing? Get me a line to Ellison. Tonight. I need the federal timeline moved up. Petrov stared at him. Not in surprise exactly. Petrov was not a man given to surprise, but with the quiet attention of someone recalibrating their understanding of the situation. You're moving on both fronts at the same time. If I don't, Mancuso's primary operation lands before the cooperation agreement provides any protection. And if the primary operation succeeds, the leverage on Marco becomes irrelevant because there's nothing left of me to leverage. And if the cooperation agreement moves fast enough, then when Gresser moves on the bait, there's a federal operation in place that catches everyone in the same net. Mancuso, Gresser, anyone else in position. And Mancuso loses both his primary operation and his contingency in the same night. Petrov was quiet for a moment. That's a very narrow window. I know. A lot of things have to move exactly right. I know that too. If it goes wrong, I know what happens if it goes wrong. Lucian's voice was steady and final. Make the calls, Petrov. He went back to Farrell, who was standing where he'd been left, hands in his coat pockets, watching the 2 men at the far end of the warehouse with the contained alertness of someone in unfamiliar territory. Lucian stopped in front of him. You have your deal, Lucian said. My man will arrange the logistics tonight. Your family leaves the city by tomorrow morning. Farrell exhaled. Not a sigh, just a slow, controlled release of held air. Thank you. Don't thank me. Lucian looked at him steadily. The 4 men above you who heard the same thing and stayed where they were. They made a calculation. So did you. Yours happened to land on the right side of something. That's not virtue. It's just math. He paused. But the math was right. So you have your deal. He left the warehouse at 8:40. In the car, Petrov beside him, he called Ellison. I need to move the timeline, Lucian said without preamble. How fast can you get a preliminary meeting with your federal contact? I told you, these things take... Ellison, I have documentation of a coordinated operation between a federal target and a confirmed inside source in my organization, a professional contracted operative currently in position for an action within 72 hours, and I have a witness who can place Vincent Mancuso in a direct meeting with a criminal informant this morning. He paused. How fast? A silence. He could hear Ellison doing the calculations that attorneys do. Risk, exposure, opportunity, sequence. Tomorrow morning, Ellison said. 8 a.m. Don't be late. The night moved fast after that. Petrov reached Maya. She listened without speaking for most of the call, and then gave a location that Petrov wrote down and did not share with Lucian, and confirmed that 4 unrecognized men arriving at that location before midnight would be permitted entry if they gave a specific phrase Petrov generated on the spot and relayed to her. The logistics took 40 minutes. Lucian spent those 40 minutes in the car, not on his phone. He sat in the back seat and watched the city outside the window, the streets he had controlled or believed he'd controlled for 30 years, the restaurants where men had brought him problems and he had solved them, the corners where his people stood and moved and maintained the machinery of an operation he had built from the inside out. It was his city in a way that he had always taken as a given, the same way you take the ground under your feet as a given. He understood that none of it had ever actually been his. The money wasn't his. The influence wasn't his. The empire that had cost him his marriage and nearly cost him his son, it had always been borrowed from the city, from the people under him, from a system of fear and obligation that held only as long as no one examined the structure too closely. Danny had examined it and found the gaps. Mancuso had exploited them. And Lucian had missed all of it because he had been in Sicily. Because he had been in Sicily, and his phone had rung at 2:47 in the morning, and he had pressed a button. Petrov confirmed at 11:15 that 4 men were in position. Lucian texted the unknown number. They're protected. 4 men. Good ones. They don't know where you are, and neither do I. This is not a trick. 3 minutes passed. Then, okay. 1 word this time. But the same number. She was reading his messages. She was choosing to respond. He didn't know what that meant beyond the surface meaning, and he wasn't going to construct a narrative around it. He put the phone in his pocket. At midnight, Carol sent through the first complete document package. 47 pages of financial records, account structures, transaction logs, and cross-referenced evidence of the Mancuso payments. It was clean and organized and devastating. It was the architecture of everything Lucian had built laid out in a format designed specifically to destroy it. He read it in the car, all 47 pages, and then sent Carol a message that said, "Good work. You're protected. Stand by for tomorrow." He got back to the penthouse at 1 in the morning and went directly to his office. He stood at the window. The city below was wet again. It had started raining sometime in the last hour. A cold January rain that made the streetlights blur and run together like something being painted over. He thought about Farrell, 4 months old, his daughter. He had stood in a cold warehouse and crossed every line a man in his position could cross because he had a 4-month-old daughter, and somewhere in the structure of that decision was a version of the thing Lucian had failed to do on a rain-soaked night when his wife went into labor alone. His phone buzzed. Petrov. Gresser identified. He has a staging location in Greenpoint. We have eyes on it. Lucian looked at the message. Then he looked at the city through the rain-streaked glass. 72 hours, Farrell had said. More likely 48 now, with the timeline compressed. He had a federal meeting at 8 in the morning, a professional operative with eyes on his remaining infrastructure, a defector who needed to be moved before dawn, a financial package that represented the controlled demolition of 3 decades of work, 4 men protecting a woman and child who didn't want his protection and needed it anyway. And somewhere in Howard Beach, Danny Caruso, the man who had sat across from him for 20 years and smiled with someone else's money in his pocket, waiting to find out whether the operation he had helped design would succeed before Mancuso decided he was a liability, and made the calculation that only one kind of ending made operational sense. Lucian turned from the window. He picked up his jacket from the chair where he'd dropped it and put it back on, and checked the document package one more time on his phone and confirmed Ellison's address, and checked the time, 1:17 in the morning, and thought about Marco asleep somewhere in the city, safe for now, with 4 men outside a door he didn't know the address of, and a mother who had been stronger than anyone had given her credit for being, and a name she had chosen alone in a hospital room while his phone showed read and sent no reply. He went to get the only thing he still had left to offer, the truth about everything he'd done, laid out in 47 pages, delivered to people whose job it was to close the door on men like him. And in a staging location in Greenpoint, a man named Gresser sat across a table from 2 of Mancuso's senior people and slid a photograph across the surface, a photograph taken that afternoon of Lucian Moretti leaving a building on Park Avenue, and said, in the flat transactional tone of a professional who had done this many times in many cities, "Tomorrow night. This ends tomorrow night." The federal meeting lasted 4 hours and 11 minutes. Lucian arrived at Ellison's office at 7:58 in the morning with the 47-page document package on an encrypted drive and a second drive containing Carol's supplementary records, transaction logs, access credentials, communication metadata that she had completed at 4 in the morning and sent through a channel she would subsequently close permanently. He had not slept. He had showered and changed and put on a suit that was neither his best nor his worst, the kind of suit that communicated seriousness without performance. And he had sat in the back of the car on the way downtown and watched the city wake up around him and felt the specific, clarifying calm of a man who has made an irreversible decision and is now simply executing it. The 2 federal agents who came to Ellison's office were not what Lucian had expected, which was itself a thing he noted. He had expected the particular brand of contained aggression that federal agents brought to meetings with men like him, the posture of people who had been trying to put you in a room for years and were now sitting across from you, trying not to show how much they wanted the thing you were offering. These two were different. The woman, who introduced herself only by a last name, Reyes, was 40 or so, with the kind of stillness that came from having run a long investigation and learned patience the hard way. The man with her, Torres, was younger and quieter and took notes by hand in a small notebook, which Lucian found oddly reassuring. Reyes opened with, "We know who you are. We know what you run. We've had 3 incomplete cases against your organization in the last decade. What we don't know is why you're here, and we need to understand that before we discuss anything else." Lucian looked at her steadily. "My son is 10 weeks old. His location was disclosed to Vincent Mancuso this morning by a man who worked for me for 20 years. Mancuso intends to use him as leverage if a direct action against me fails within the next 48 hours. He paused. "I'm here because the only way to close all of this, Mancuso, the inside source, the operation Mancuso has staged, in a way that leaves my son safe, is to give you everything and let your process do what my process cannot do cleanly anymore." Reyes looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Torres. Then she looked back at Lucian. "Show me the documents," she said. He showed her the documents. Torres stopped taking notes by hand about 20 minutes in and opened a laptop instead. Reyes asked questions that were precise and sequential and occasionally doubled back to test consistency. The technique of someone checking a story against itself rather than against outside information. Lucian answered every question directly. He did not minimize. He did not redirect. He had made the decision to be completely honest in this room, and the decision had a physical quality to it, a loosening of something he had been holding for a very long time. At the 2-hour mark, Reyes stepped out of the room with her phone. She was gone 11 minutes. When she came back, she sat down and looked at Lucian with a slightly different expression. Not warmer, but recalibrated. "The Gresser name," she said. "We know him. He's been on a European watch list for 3 years. If he's in the city and staged for an operation tonight, tomorrow night was the timeline I was given," Lucian said. "But Mancuso knows I've been running a damage assessment on the Caruso leak. He may move it up. Then we need to move faster than he does." She looked at Torres. "Get the SAC on the phone." Then back to Lucian. "I need the Greenpoint location confirmed, and I need eyes on Mancuso's Howard Beach property within the hour. Can your man, Petrov, can he give us a direct communication channel without burning his cover?" "Petrov has no cover to burn," Lucian said. "He's been visible in my organization for 15 years. Then he's going to need the same protections you're negotiating for yourself. He'll cooperate." The next 2 hours were the specific controlled chaos of a large operation beginning to mobilize. Calls made and received, Ellison arguing points of the cooperation agreement with a precision that occasionally made Reyes visibly impatient, Torres cross-referencing the document package against existing federal files with a speed that told Lucian this information was filling gaps that had been open for years. At one point, a 3rd federal agent arrived with a physical folder that he handed to Reyes without speaking, and she read it standing up and then set it face down on the table and said, "To no one in particular, Gresser moved up the timeline. He's in position as of 6 this morning." Lucian felt his jaw tighten. "Then it's tonight." "It's tonight," Reyes confirmed. She looked at him. "The protection on your wife and son, I need that location, not for the operation, for a separate protective detail that has no connection to anything Mancuso or Gresser could have visibility on. My man Petrov has the location, I don't." She studied him. "You deliberately didn't know?" "Yes." Something shifted in her expression. Not softness, but a different kind of assessment. "Okay," she said. "Get me Petrov." He stepped outside Ellison's office and called Petrov and explained what was needed. Petrov was quiet for a moment and then said, "She's not going to like federal agents at the door." "She's going to like Mancuso's people at the door less," Lucian said. "Tell her it's 2 agents, credentials she can verify, and they stay outside unless she invites them in. Her choice. And if she says no, then she says no, and we figure out something else." He paused. "But tell Tell her I'm asking, not ordering, asking. He went back inside and gave Reyes Petrov's number and sat down and waited while the machinery he had set in motion moved through its sequence. Ellison slid a document across the table, a preliminary cooperation framework, and Lucian read it with the focused attention he gave contracts that had consequences. He made 3 requests for specific language changes. Reyes approved 2 of them without discussion and pushed back on the 3rd for 7 minutes before a compromise landed. Lucian signed the preliminary framework at 11:43 in the morning. He walked out of Ellison's building into the cold January noon and stood on the sidewalk for a moment. The city moved around him. People with coffee, people with phones, a delivery truck blocking half the lane while the driver argued with someone on his headset. The ordinary motion of a city that continued regardless. He called Carol. "It's done. The preliminary is signed." A silence. "Are you okay?" "I'm functional," he said. "You'll be contacted today about your own agreement. Cooperate fully. Everything you have." "I already sent everything." "I know. Thank you, Carol." He hung up and got in the car and told Sal to drive and didn't give a destination, and they drove through the city for 40 minutes while Lucian sat in the back and let the adrenaline that had been carrying him for 36 hours begin its slow metabolization into something heavier and less clean. His hands, when he looked at them, were completely still. He had good hands for this, for the aftermath of things. He had trained them to be still. He was no longer sure whether that was an asset or a symptom. He thought about Danny, not with rage, which surprised him. He had expected rage when he finally got to sit with the full knowledge of what Danny had done. 20 years of proximity, 20 years of trust extended and quietly monetized and weaponized. And instead what he found was something more uncomfortable than rage, a kind of tired recognition. Danny had seen Lucian clearly, had understood his weaknesses, the marriage failing, the affair, the pattern of prioritizing the empire over the personal, and had used that understanding as a tool. In a different context, in a different world, that level of perception and patience would have been something Lucian valued. The difference between a trusted lieutenant and a long-term threat was sometimes only the direction of their loyalty. Danny had simply pointed his in a different direction, and Lucian had never looked closely enough to see it. He thought about the night Marco was born, about the phone ringing in a Sicilian bedroom, about the button he had pressed. He thought, if he had gotten on the plane that night, if he had been in the hospital, if Serena had not needed to build an exit because the exit had never become necessary, Danny's plan would still have been in motion. The financial diversion was already 14 months old at that point, possibly more. But the specific vulnerability that Danny had used, Lucian's distraction, his compromised attention, his weeks of operating at reduced capacity because he was managing grief and guilt and a disintegrating marriage, that vulnerability might not have existed. He had handed Danny the weapon by being the husband he had been. The affair, the missed birth, the ring on the kitchen counter, all of it had been operational material for a man who was patient enough to wait for exactly the right kind of damage. The car stopped at a red light somewhere in the 50s. A woman pushed a stroller through the crosswalk in front of them, moving fast against the cold. The baby inside bundled to near invisibility. Lucian watched her cross and felt something in his chest that had no clean name. Not grief, not hope, not the specific warm devastation of thinking about Marco. Something that contained all of those things without being any one of them. He told Sal to take him back to the penthouse. The operation began at 9 that evening. Lucian was not part of it. That had been explicit in the agreement. He provided information and documentation. He stayed out of the operational execution. He did not put himself in a position that could compromise federal personnel or the evidentiary chain. He sat in the penthouse and monitored through 2 channels. Petrov, who had been fully integrated into the federal operation as a cooperating source, and who sent brief, factual texts at intervals, and Ellison, who had a contact inside the operation and who called twice with updates. The first call from Ellison came at 10:17. Gresser's staging location has been secured. 4 individuals in custody, Gresser among them. No shots fired. Mancuso. Howard Beach property is under simultaneous action. Still in progress. Lucian sat with the phone in his hand and listened to the quiet of the penthouse around him, and waited. The second call came at 11:40. Mancuso is in custody. 11 arrests total across 3 locations. The operation is... Ellison paused, and in the pause, Lucian could hear him choosing the right word. It's complete. Danny, Lucian said. Caruso was at the Howard Beach property. He's in custody. Alive. Alive. Unharmed. Another pause. He's going to cooperate with the federal side. His attorney is already there. Lucian absorbed this. Danny alive and cooperating meant Danny's testimony would go into the federal case, would add to what Lucian had already provided, would fill gaps, would make the case against Mancuso as complete as anything a prosecutor could want. It also meant that Danny would receive some version of a deal for his cooperation. The man who had spent 22 months dismantling the Moretti organization from the inside and who had handed Lucian's family's location to a man capable of using it against a 10-week-old child would, in all likelihood, serve reduced time in exchange for his testimony. Lucian sat with that fact. He did not like it. He also understood that he was in no position to object to the mechanisms of a process he had voluntarily entered, and that the desire for a specific kind of personal justice was exactly the kind of thing he was in the process of walking away from. "Okay," he said. "Get some sleep," Ellison said. "Tomorrow is going to be a long day." He put the phone down and looked at the penthouse around him. The art on the walls that Serena had chosen. The furniture arranged the way she had arranged it. The nursery down the hall with the crib he had assembled on a Sunday in October, the mobile still and silent above it. He had been living in a space that had stopped being his in any real sense weeks ago, surrounded by evidence of a life that had been built together and that had come apart because of who he had chosen to be when choices were most revealing. He went to the nursery. He stood in the doorway in the dark. The mobile caught the light from the hallway, thin silver lines catching and releasing the glow as a draft moved through the apartment. He stood there for a long time. At some point he went to bed. He slept, finally, the deep and largely dreamless sleep of total exhaustion. He woke at 6:15 to a text from Petrov. Federal protection detail confirmed in place. She was cooperative. She asked that you not contact her directly for the time being. He read it twice. Then he typed back, "Understood. Thank you." The following weeks were the most structurally complex of his life, which was a high bar. The cooperation agreement moved from preliminary to formal. Carroll testified before a federal grand jury for 2 days. Lucian himself sat across from federal attorneys for 16 hours spread across 3 sessions, going through the organization's structure, operations, personnel, and finances with the methodical completeness of a man who had decided that if he was going to do this, he was going to do it entirely. Ellison was present for every session. Reyes ran 2 of them herself. She was good at her job in a way he could appreciate professionally, asking questions in an order that seemed random and was anything but, catching inconsistencies between his account and Carroll's account and surfacing them without accusation to see how he handled them. He handled them by correcting himself, twice, where his memory had papered over details he hadn't thought to include. The Moretti organization, what remained of it after the Mancuso operation, after Carroll's records, after the cascading effect of Lucian's own disclosure, was dismantled over a period of 60 days. Accounts frozen, then forfeited. Properties seized through civil asset proceedings. The legitimate businesses examined, and where they were genuinely clean, separated from the process. Where they were not, added to the forfeiture schedule. Lucian's personal assets, the penthouse, the car, 3 investment accounts, a property in Connecticut he had bought and never used, were substantially absorbed by the settlement. He was left with a specific amount of money, negotiated by Ellison with the precision of a man who understood the difference between punishment and destruction. Enough to live on without comfort for a defined period, not enough to reconstitute anything resembling what had been. He was left with a cooperation agreement that provided him significant sentencing consideration in exchange for testimony that would be central to the Mancuso prosecution. He was left with a monitoring arrangement, a federal supervisor, quarterly check-ins, restrictions on travel and association, that would run for 5 years. He moved out of the penthouse on a Tuesday in March, carrying 2 bags. He did not take the art. He did not take most of what was there. He took clothes, a few books, some documents, and the photograph from his wallet, the one from before everything, From a weekend in Vermont 7 years ago when he and Serena had rented a house near a lake and spent 3 days doing almost nothing, and she had laughed at something he'd said at dinner on the second night, and he had taken a photograph of her laughing because something about the moment had told him to keep it, and he had carried it ever since without examining why. He moved into an apartment in a neighborhood in Brooklyn that bore no connection to any location he had ever used professionally. It was a third-floor walk-up with windows that looked out at a fire escape and a narrow strip of sky. It was small and clean and entirely anonymous. He paid the first month's rent in cash that was within the terms of his agreement, and carried his 2 bags up the stairs and stood in the empty living room and looked at the walls. He was 51 years old, and he was starting from nothing, and the nothing was the first honest thing he'd had in 30 years. He got a job, which was a word that had previously had no personal relevance to him, through a contact Ellison had, completely legitimate, a security consulting firm that assessed corporate vulnerability and did not ask its employees to do anything outside the law. The work was analytical. He was good at it in ways that required no criminal application. He understood systems, understood how people inside organizations made decisions and where they left gaps, understood the psychology of people who believed they were safe when they were not. His new employer knew who he was and what he had done. The federal agreement required disclosure to any employer. The employer had decided the same qualities that made him a useful criminal made him a useful consultant. Lucian accepted this pragmatic assessment without taking comfort from it. He reported to an office 4 days a week. He ate lunch alone at a counter in a diner near the office. He went home in the evenings and read or cooked badly, the specific culinary ineptitude of a man who had always had other people managing this part of life and was now confronting it without preparation. He burned rice twice in the first week and ate cereal for dinner 3 nights in a row, and eventually bought a cookbook and worked through it with the methodical approach he applied to everything, and by the end of the second month he could cook 4 things reliably. He did not drink much. He had never been a heavy drinker. It compromised judgment, and he had always valued judgment above comfort. But he reduced further what little he had consumed before, because he understood that the shape of his days now required him to be clear in a way that had nothing to do with operational efficiency and everything to do with not allowing the empty evenings to find a chemical solution. He did not contact Serena. He had agreed to her terms through Petrov's communication, and he held to them with the same discipline he applied to everything. He knew, through Ellison's occasional updates on the legal side, that the divorce was proceeding through its formal stages. He had instructed his attorney to raise no objections and to agree to whatever Serena's attorney proposed within the terms of the law, including the child custody arrangement, which Serena's side had initially proposed as supervised visitation pending a family court evaluation. He had agreed to supervised visitation without counteroffer. His federal supervisor, a woman named Park, who conducted the quarterly meetings with a brisk, non-judgmental efficiency that he appreciated, noted in his second quarterly review that he was in full compliance with every term of the agreement and that she had received no adverse reports from his employer or his neighbors or any of the monitoring mechanisms that were part of his arrangement. She said this in a tone that was neither congratulatory nor suspicious, simply factual, and then asked if he had anything to report. He told her about 2 contacts from former associates that he had declined and reported through the proper channel, as required. She noted them. She asked if he needed any support resources. He said he did not. She reminded him the next check-in would be in 3 months and concluded the meeting. He walked out of the federal building into an April afternoon that had decided, without any meteorological justification, to be briefly warm, and he stood on the sidewalk and tilted his face upward for a moment before he caught himself doing it and started walking. He received a letter from Serena's attorney in May. It was formal and contained the terms of the custody evaluation process, dates, locations, the name of the court-appointed evaluator, the procedure for the supervised visitation schedule to begin once the evaluation was complete. He read it 3 times and then called his own attorney and confirmed that everything was in order and that there was nothing he needed to do except appear at the scheduled evaluation on the stated date. He appeared. He sat across from a court evaluator named Dr. Marsh, a man in his late 50s with reading glasses he kept taking off and putting back on, and answered questions for 90 minutes about his history, his current circumstances, his cooperation agreement, his employment, his understanding of what had happened in his marriage, and why. He answered everything directly. He did not minimize the affair. He did not minimize missing Marco's birth. He did not minimize the 20 years he had spent running a criminal organization that had produced the specific set of enemies who had threatened his infant son's safety. He said all of these things in plain language without the particular kind of self-serving qualification that people under evaluation sometimes constructed around their own failures. Dr. Marsh asked, near the end, "What do you want from this process?" Lucian thought about the question honestly. "I want to know my son," he said. "I want him to know me, the version of me that exists now, not the one that existed before. I'm not asking for anything beyond what the process determines is appropriate. I understand why the process is cautious. I understand what I'm asking people to trust." He paused. "I'm not in a hurry. I know what I did. I know what it cost. I'm not trying to negotiate my way back to something I lost. I'm trying to build something that didn't exist before. That takes time, and I understand that." Dr. Marsh wrote something on his notepad. He did not share what it was. The evaluation process took 8 weeks. In August, the court approved a supervised visitation arrangement, 2 hours per week, in a neutral location, with a court-appointed supervisor present for the initial period. The letter from his attorney arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, and he sat at the small table in the Brooklyn apartment and read it, and then set it down and looked out the window at the fire escape for a long time. He called his attorney back and said, "Confirm the schedule. Whatever dates they propose, I accept." The first visit was on a Thursday morning in September. Marco was 9 months old. The location was a family services center. Clean, brightly lit, rooms designed with the particular deliberate warmth of spaces that needed to be neutral without feeling institutional. Toys on low shelves, a rug with colors in it. A woman named Sandra, who was the court supervisor and who introduced herself with a professional kindness and then positioned herself in the corner of the room in a way that was present without being intrusive. Serena brought Marco. Lucian was already in the room when they arrived. He had been there for 20 minutes, sitting in one of the low chairs, because he had not trusted himself to be calm if he arrived and had to wait in a hallway, and he needed to be calm more than he had ever needed anything. Serena came in first. She looked different than the last time he had seen her, which had been the morning she had walked out of the penthouse with their son in a carrier against her chest, and he had been asleep, and she had not woken him. She was thinner. Her hair was shorter, cut to her jaw. She looked like someone who had been through something large and had come out the other side and was still in the process of deciding what to do with the person they'd become. She looked at him. She did not smile. She did not look away either. She held his gaze for a moment with an expression that was not angry and not warm, but that acknowledged him as a real thing in the room, which was more than he had a right to expect. Marco was on her hip, 9 months old, round-faced, dark-eyed, wearing a blue shirt with a small dog embroidered on the pocket. He was looking at the room with the focused, solemn attention of babies at the age when the world is still perpetually new. He looked at the toys. He looked at Sandra in the corner. He looked at Lucian. He did not look away. Lucian sat still. He did not reach out. He did not make any sudden motion. He had thought about this moment for months in the Brooklyn apartment, on evenings when the silence had enough space in it for thinking. He had thought about what he would say, and had concluded there was nothing to say that the situation didn't already contain. "Hi," he said, to Marco. Just that. Marco blinked. His mouth worked through something. Not quite a smile, the preparatory motion of a face that hasn't settled on its expressions yet. And then he looked at the toy shelf. Serena crossed the room and sat in the chair across from Lucian and set Marco on the floor between them on the colored rug, and Marco immediately began moving toward the nearest toy with the focused, crawling determination of someone who has recently discovered locomotion and is still delighted by it. They sat and watched him in silence for a moment. Then Serena said quietly, to no one in particular, or to the room in general, "He started crawling 6 weeks ago. He's fast." "He looks fast," Lucian said. Another silence. Marco had reached the toy, a set of stacking rings, and was examining them with the concentration that suggested he had important opinions about them. "I heard about the testimony," Serena said, not looking at Lucian, looking at Marco. "The Mancuso case." It goes to trial in January. Will it? She stopped. Started again. Will it be a problem for you, testifying? It was always going to be a problem, he said. That was the cost of the arrangement. I understood that going in. She nodded, still watching Marco. I'm not going to tell you it's enough, she said. What you did. I'm not going to say it cancels anything out. It doesn't work like that. I know it doesn't. I need you to understand that this, she gestured, a small motion that encompassed the room, the supervision, the careful architecture of this 2-hour window. This is what I can give right now. Not because I want to punish you, because it's what I have. It's enough, he said. It's more than enough. She looked at him then, directly, the way she used to look at him in the early years when she was still deciding who he was. He held that look without flinching and without performing anything, just held it and let her see whatever was actually there. You look different, she said. I am different, he said. I can't prove that in this room in 2 hours. I'm not trying to. I know you're not. She looked back at Marco. That's the only reason I came. Marco had stacked 2 of the rings, imprecisely, the smaller one below the larger, and was regarding this structural achievement with visible satisfaction. He turned and looked at Lucian with his father's dark eyes in his mother's face and held out one of the rings. Lucian looked at the ring, then at his son's face. He leaned forward slowly and took the ring from Marco's hand. Their fingers touched in the exchange, the baby's small, warm fingers against his, and Marco made a sound that was approximately a syllable and turned back to the remaining rings with the absolute sovereign indifference of someone who has made an offering and considers the transaction complete. Lucian sat with the ring in his hand. It was orange plastic, slightly damp from being chewed. He held it like something that required care. Serena was watching him. He became aware of this without looking at her. He kept his eyes on Marco. The 2 hours moved the way significant time moves, as both faster and slower than ordinary time, the minutes having more weight than their duration justified. Marco crawled to Lucian at one point and pulled himself to standing using Lucian's knee, which Marco apparently regarded as a structural feature of the environment rather than a part of a person, and stood there with the focused effort of someone managing a new skill, and then sat down abruptly and looked surprised. And Lucian said without thinking, "You almost had it." And Marco looked up at him with an expression of pure assessment and then crawled away. Serena watched this without expression. Then, after a moment, something moved across her face that she didn't prevent. A small, involuntary shift, the particular softness that comes when you see the thing you were hoping for without having admitted you were hoping for it. She looked away before it fully arrived, but it had been there. At the end of the 2 hours, Sandra stood and said gently that the session was concluding. Serena picked Marco up from the floor and settled him on her hip and stood. Lucian stood. They were on opposite sides of the colored rug, the same distance apart they'd been at the beginning. Same time next week, Serena said. Not a question, not a concession, just a statement of fact. I'll be here, he said. She nodded and turned toward the door. At the door she stopped, not turning back, just pausing with one hand on the frame. He likes the stacking rings, she said. He'll keep handing them to you. He does that with things he likes. Then she went through the door with their son and was gone. Lucian stood in the room for a moment after she left. Sandra was putting the toys back on the shelf with the quiet efficiency of someone who had witnessed many of these sessions and understood the value of not filling the aftermath with sound. He set the orange ring on the table beside him. He picked up his jacket from the chair. He looked at the colored rug, at the small indentations in the pile where Marco had sat and crawled and pulled himself upright using Lucian's knee. He walked out into the September afternoon. The city was doing what cities did, moving, indifferent, loud in the particular way that New York was loud, even when it wasn't trying to be. He stood on the sidewalk outside the Family Services Center and thought about a drive through New York at 2:40 in the morning, 11 months ago. Serena in a car she had arranged herself, Marco against her chest, leaving a life she had determined she could not continue to live. He thought about a phone ringing in Sicily, about a button pressed in the dark. He thought about what Farrell had said in a cold warehouse in January. I don't know what that makes me. And what Lucian had said back, it makes you someone who still has a line. He understood now, standing on a Brooklyn sidewalk in September with nothing left of what he had built, and something small and new beginning in its place. That the line was not the dramatic thing. The line was not the warehouse, not the federal meeting, not the testimony, not the dismantlement of 3 decades of constructed power. The line was smaller and older than all of that. The line was a phone ringing in the dark. The line was the button you did or did not press. The line was what you did with the second chance you didn't deserve, in the 2 hours a week that the law and the circumstances and the woman you had failed were willing to give you. He started walking. The city moved around him. He was a man in a suit walking home on a Thursday afternoon, carrying nothing, recognizable to no one, starting from the only honest place he had ever actually occupied. It was not enough. He knew that. It would not be enough for a long time. But Marco had held out a plastic ring, warm from his small hands, and Lucian had taken it. And Serena had stood in a doorway and said, "Same time next week." He kept walking. Nearly 2 years after that first Thursday, on a Tuesday afternoon in July that had turned warm without warning, Marco said his name. Not Lucian. Not the careful, formal distance of a name used by someone still deciding. He said Dada, imprecisely, the way 19-month-olds say most things. Standing in Serena's kitchen with a piece of cracker in one fist and his other hand reaching upward toward Lucian, who was crouching on the kitchen floor at Marco's eye level, because that was where you needed to be to have a conversation with a 19-month-old. The supervised visits had ended at the 6-month mark. The family court evaluation had concluded that Lucian presented no safety risk and demonstrated consistent, appropriate engagement. The visitation had expanded to 4 hours, then to half-days, then to an arrangement that looked less like a legal schedule and more like something 2 people were figuring out together, cautiously, without a roadmap. Serena was at the counter when Marco said it. She was slicing fruit and she stopped and she turned and she looked at her son and then at Lucian, and Lucian was looking at Marco with an expression he couldn't have controlled if he'd tried. Open in a way his face had not been open in 30 years of a life that had required the opposite. He said quietly, "Hey, buddy." Marco offered him the cracker with the seriousness of someone making a substantial gift. Lucian took it. He held it between 2 fingers and looked at it and did not trust himself to speak for a moment. Serena turned back to the fruit. Her shoulders held something she was not sharing with the room. After a moment, she said without turning around, "He's been practicing that." "Has he?" Lucian said. His voice came out rough. For about a week, Maya thought it was hilarious. A pause. The knife moving again. "I didn't tell you because I wanted you to hear it when it happened." He sat down on the kitchen floor. Not in a staged way. Just because standing suddenly required more than he had. He sat on the linoleum, and Marco crawled into his lap with the proprietorial ease of someone claiming established territory, and sat there eating his cracker and watching the room with the absolute present tense attention of a child who has not yet learned to live anywhere except exactly where he is. Lucian sat on the kitchen floor of the apartment that was not his, in a life he was still learning to live honestly, holding his son, and he did not say anything because there was nothing that needed saying. And the afternoon light came through the window at the angle that late afternoon light comes in July and lay across the floor beside them, and Serena sliced fruit at the counter, and Marco finished the cracker and started in on Lucian's watch strap with focused, exploratory fingers. It was not a fairy tale. Serena had not forgiven him in any complete sense and had not said she was going to. The divorce was finalized. Whatever this was, this careful, real, unromantic thing they were building in the space left after everything had burned, it did not have a name yet, and neither of them was trying to give it one. It would be what it became. It would cost what it cost. There were no guarantees and no scripts, and no version of this that didn't require waking up every day and choosing, again, to be the person he was trying to become rather than the one he had been. He understood that. He accepted it in a way that was not resignation, but was something harder and more durable than hope. Marco looked up at him. Dark eyes. His mother's nose. A face still becoming whatever it was going to be. "Dada," he said again, with the casual repetition of someone who has learned a new word and is establishing its reliability. "Yeah," Lucian said. "That's right." Outside the window, the city continued, indifferent and enormous, and entirely unchanged by any of this. 51 years old, and starting over, and sitting on a kitchen floor with nothing left of what he had built, and the only title he had ever earned that mattered resting in the mouth of a 19-month-old boy with cracker crumbs on his shirt. It was enough. For the first time in a very long time, it was exactly enough.